Hello, this is Dr. John Schrage, and I am here today to give you a quick lecture about the business of controls of climate and climate classification. Uh, just so that we're clear on this topic here, when we're talking about climate, we're going to be talking about the average day-to-day weather over a very long period of time, typically something like 30 years. So, like if you're talking about the average temperature in December, you mean the average temperature over the last 30 years of Decembers. Um, Meteorologists, by and large, are not big fans of climate. To them, your day-to-day weather forecasters find climate fairly boring, which is peculiar because in many ways climate is much more important than meteorology is. Climate is what fundamentally determines things like where people live or what we can eat in that area, what kind of housing we have to live in, and what kind of clothing you have to wear. Almost any passing weather pattern, a cold front, a warm front, even a hurricane or something like that. Well, once it's gone, things go back to the way they were before. Whereas climate dictates on long time scales what kind of things are and are not possible in your region. I want to be clear that what we're going to be talking about in this section of the lecture here is going to be about macroclimate. This is going to be in contrast to microclimate. Here we have a nice little example of a microclimate. Clearly around this rock it is warmer than it is a little ways away from the rock. This just has to do with the fact that the rock is absorbing sunlight and then emitting long-wave radiation that is melting the snow. Okay, the climate under the rock and near the rock is clearly different than the climate even, a few meters away. Microclimate's actually pretty interesting stuff, but it's not really what we're aiming for here. In the same sort of way, we're not interested in mesoclimate. Mesoclimate, or medium-sized climate scales, would be more like, for example, over small areas like a city or a valley or something like that. Maybe it is cooler in this down by the river and it is warmer out in the suburbs, or something like that. Or maybe like in LA, there's one climate down by the shore and another climate up in the hills. That's not really what we're going for here either. Rather, what we're talking about is macroclimate, the large-scale climate of large regions. What is the Southwest like? What is Florida like? What is a desert like, etc.? We're talking about the climate over an area at least the size of maybe several states. Let's talk for a little while about the kinds of processes that are going to determine the climate or control the climate of a particular region. In some ways, this is actually kind of a review from the whole semester. There's a reason why we do this climate stuff at the end. It's not exactly like a cumulative material, but it's something like that. And we're going to find out that fundamentally there have been 7 climate controls, 7 processes that are determining what the climate of a region is like. Our first climate control comes back to us from the very first unit of the course, and that's this whole business of intensity of sunshine. Back then we learned about the ideas like beam spreading and sun angles and so on. And we also learned about ideas like the length of daylight, all of which was the one that were the factors that were determining how much radiation from the sun is going to reach the surface of the earth. The take-home message we had of that unit was that low-latitude climates, like in the tropics, are going to be warmer, of course, because they have more hours. Well, that's not entirely true. They have high sun angles. Length of sunlight can also be a factor as well. More importantly, though, sure, they're warmer, but these low-latitude locations are also going to have less of a difference between their winter and their summertime climate. Let me give you an example here. How about 2 locations, one of which is closer to the equator and one of which is farther away? Let's take Miami and New York. Well, let's start at Miami. What's a good summertime temperature in Miami? I didn't look this up to get the official numbers or anything like that, but a good guess is something like in the 80s or 90s in the summer in Miami. In contrast, what's a good wintertime temperature in Miami? Well, there's a reason why people go to Miami in the winter. It just doesn't get all that cold, maybe in the 60s. Now, if we compare that to, say, New York City. New York City has a good summertime temperature of maybe the 70s or the 80s, but in the winter it gets pretty cold. They have severe winters there. A good wintertime temperature maybe is in the 10s or the 20s. So even though, okay, we had this idea that, Miami is closer to the equator, so it should be warmer. Yes, it is warmer overall, but more interestingly and more importantly, Miami is also overall having a smaller difference between its summertime and its wintertime temperatures than places farther away from the equator are. A place like New York has a very large difference between its summer and its wintertime temperature. Our second most important climate control is going to be the distribution of land and water. How close is our location to a large body of water? Is it far inland or is it near the shore? Regions that are close to bodies of water tend to have a much milder climate than you would expect compared to a location that is farther inland. You'll often hear words like a marine climate. That's a very mild, wet climate right near the coast, versus a continental climate, which is when it has a much more extreme climate farther inland. Just as a way to talk about this, let's compare two cities that are at approximately the same latitude. We'll talk about Seattle and Fargo. Now, based on what we learned from our first climate control, well, they're at the same latitude, you would think that they would have very similar climates. But in fact, Seattle is a much milder climate than Fargo. Seattle has very little winter, but very little summer either. The differences between their summertime and their wintertime temperatures just aren't that great. In contrast, Fargo, of course, has very warm summers. They're at least as warm as we are here in Omaha, but obviously their winters are very severe. Their differences between their temperatures of their summer and their winter are huge. So if we were comparing the climates of, say, Seattle and Fargo, they're at the same latitude, but they have a very different climate. Fargo is in general warmer than Seattle in the summer, but colder than Seattle in the summer, and that's simply because Fargo is very far inland, hundreds and hundreds of miles from the nearest open ocean, whereas Seattle is right there on a very mild bay. Our third climate control is going to be about ocean currents. If you're going to be at a location that is near the ocean, then the temperature of the water that is right there is going to obviously make a big difference. We can compare some examples here, like for example, those two yellow dots that I have on the map. One is roughly the location of San Francisco, and one is roughly the location of, say, I don't know, Maryland or Delaware or something like that. They're approximately the same latitude, and they are both on the water, so you would think that based on our first two climate controls, they should have very similar climates. But in practice, they do not. San Francisco is on a cold ocean current coming down the coast of North America from up by Alaska, and has a much cooler climate than, say, along the east coast of the United States, where they have a warm current, the Gulf Stream, coming up from the south. In the same sort of way, you can see down along South America, there are places where they have cold ocean currents coming up from Antarctica, and on the other side of the continent, at the same latitude, they have a warm ocean current, and they have a much more tropical climate. Remember back to the third unit of the course when we learned all that stuff about general circulation and the large-scale winds patterns of the world? We could call those kind of wind patterns that we were learning in there the prevailing winds. Different areas around the world have different prevailing wind patterns, the kind of winds that they expect on more or less every day. In general, in this unit of the course, by the way, you would not be expected to memorize the prevailing winds. You should just be able to think through how the prevailing winds at a location are going to be affecting the climate. Climate control, number 4, then, is prevailing winds. If your prevailing winds in a location are typically coming from a location that is, I don't know, dry or moist or continental or marine or whatever, your climate will be more like that than it would otherwise have been. For example, here is a shoreline that happens to be at a receiving its winds are coming from a tropical ocean, and so they have a very moist tropical climate. I like this example better here. Here's the map of the annual average precipitation around the United States. Well, both like the southwest United States and the southeast United States typically has winds mostly coming from the south, but obviously this makes a very big difference to the climate. Across the southeast United States, that means that they're going to get a lot of precipitation and have high annual average rainfall. Whereas like over the southwest United States, Arizona, New Mexico, and so on, that means that the prevailing winds are bringing hot, dry air off the deserts of Mexico, and they have a much drier climate. Again, back in that third unit of the course when we were talking about general circulation, another aspect of the general circulation that we tended to talk about is where were there semi-permanent high-pressure systems and semi-permanent low-pressure systems. Places like under the subtropical highs had high pressure most of the time, whereas, say, under the ITCZ had low pressure most of the time. We could kind of wrap that together and call it the fifth climate control, the position of highs and lows. If you're under a place where the general circulation is telling us that there's going to generally be high pressure, like under the subtropical highs, you're going to get very little precipitation, even if your location is near water. Whereas conversely, if you are under a location that the general circulation should be causing you to have low pressure most of the time, you're going to get lots more precipitation than you would expect, especially if you were far from water. Probably a classic example of this would be the western coast of West Africa. Like this is what the Western Sahel. We're right next to a body of water. You would think that that would mean that you have a very wet climate, but you're also under the subtropical highs, which means that these locations have very little precipitation. Western Sahara is a desert. In contrast, for example, let's think about central Brazil. Central Brazil is hundreds and hundreds of miles away from an ocean. You would think it would have a very continental climate. It would be relatively dry with big differences between the winter and summertime temperatures. But of course, central Brazil is under the ITCZ. It's under a permanent, or at least long, semi-permanent area of low pressure. And as a consequence, it's basically a rainforest. There's always precipitation happening in that part of the world. Climate control number 6 is going to be about the presence of mountain barriers, obstacles to the flow that the air has to flow over. And of course, this is obviously related to the mountain problem, right? We remember that the windward side of the mountain tends to have a cooler and more moist climate, whereas the lee side, where we have the air descending down the mountain slope, is going to be a hotter and drier climate. A classic example of this would be associated with the weather in Seattle versus the weather on the other side of the mountains in Yakima. This is a view here in Yakima, which is only a couple hundred miles away from Seattle, and as you can see, it's a very dry climate. In contrast, here's a picture of a park inside of Seattle. There's a reason why they call Seattle the Emerald City. It's a very green place. And if we take a look at a topography map of the state of Washington, you can see Seattle and Yakima are separated by a very high range of mountains. That presence of that mountain barrier radically changes the climate of Yakima. You would think Yakima is not that far from the ocean. It would have a very marine climate, but actually they have a very dry and continental climate because of the presence of that mountain barrier. Our 7th and final climate control is simply the altitude of the location. All semester long, we've been learning about how when you lift air, it cools. And we learned that in the context of like the mountain problem, and we learned that in the context of like clouds. And it works even if you're talking about like air just flowing over this mountain here. Clearly, the top of this mountain, it is colder than it is near the base of the mountain where we have these little flowers growing. And we think about this in terms of mountains. I mean, you ski at the top of the mountains and so on. But this even works if we're talking about something like Nebraska. This is just a map. I don't remember exactly what they're plotting on here, but it has to do with the low temperatures and plant hardiness. But northwest Nebraska is quite a bit higher than southeast Nebraska. That is the only real difference here. But yet northwest Nebraska, it has a much colder climate than southeast Nebraska does, because just simply because of the changes in elevation. Elevation, then, is an important climate control. Anytime you have changes in topography, you expect changes in temperature. With colder temperatures, the higher up you go. Now that we understand all the different processes that are at work in controlling the climate of a region, it's time to think about the ways in which we can describe the climate of that region. Now, earlier in the lecture, I told you that we say that the climate of a region is the average weather experienced by that location over a long period of time, typically something like 30 years. Well, that's great if you have 30 years of weather records to work with, but that's not often the case. Weather stations are moved all the time, and so you may not know what the weather has been like at a particular location over the last few decades. Alternatively, maybe the location you're talking about doesn't have any weather stations to sample its weather. What do you do then? I mean, there's still a climate, but you don't have any straightforward statistics like mean temperature or average rainfall to describe it. In the same way, it's surprisingly hard to describe the climate of a region because the current weather of a location experiences, it's never really normal. Heck, in general, we don't even know what normal means. For example, take the weather this year. It might seem like a fair question to ask, was this year warmer or colder than normal? But again, that's a really hard question to answer. It depends on what you think normal is. Normal in our times, with the growing influence of the greenhouse effect and global warming, would not be the same as normal during past climate anomalies like the Dust Bowl or the Little Ice Age. Well, this is where a brilliant climatologist named Vladimir Koeppen steps in. Koeppen lived about 100 years ago, and his brilliant insight was to see past all of these complications. Koeppen said that you don't really need to know what normal is. You don't need to have years and years of observations taken by meteorologists with thermometers and rain gauges, because plants do all that work for us. You see, the main reason why a particular type of plants lives in one region and not in another is because of the climate of the region. I mean, sure, stuff like diseases and fires matter too, but the main reasons have to do with climate. Think about, say, Nebraska. There are no palm trees in our state. Koeppen would say that the main reason why palm trees don't live in Nebraska is because of the climate. In particular, the problem is that our winters are too cold. So according to Koeppen, if you sailed off to some unfamiliar country and discovered that there were palm trees living there, you could say right off the bat that you knew something about the climate of that new country. Its winters are apparently milder than the winters in Nebraska. You didn't have to have any specialized weather equipment because the plants were telling you what the climate was already like there. So far we've only been talking about palm trees, but Koeppen expanded this understanding to many, many other plant species. He extensively examined what kind of conditions favored all kinds of different grasses and trees and cacti and whatever, and from this information he was able to compile what he called the Handbuch der Klimatologie, or the Climatology Handbook. Based on his research, climatologists have been able to categorize all the different climates in all the different parts of the world. Jungles and rainforests, prairies, savannas, desert steppes, northern forests, tundra, wastelands. Each of these little niche climates, different kinds of plants thrive, giving meteorologists and climatologists important information about how much rain can be expected, how warm the summers are, and how cold the winters are, and so on. Koeppen's system assigns various climate types to each of the macro-scale regions of the world based on the types of plants that live there. Now, the system's actually pretty elaborate, with lots of types and subtypes and sub-subtypes. We're not going to go into all that detail, but we are going to focus on his 6 main climate types. Each of these climate types is assigned a letter, so we'll talk about type A climate or type B climate or whatever. Now, yes, you do have to memorize each of these letters. You don't have to worry about the fact that, like, there are type AM climates or ABD climates, but the type A, the first letter of the system, you always have to know. But before we get to that, I want to talk about a couple of problems and complications with regard to the Koeppen system. For one thing, the Koeppen system doesn't give us any information about what to do over water. The climate over the oceans is important for a number of reasons, but there's no plants there. There's no forests over the ocean or anything like that, so the Koeppen system just fails right there. Keep in mind, too, that, as I said before, plants do thrive or fail for reasons that don't have anything directly to do with climate, things like diseases and so on. Invasive species would be another one. Okay, but the main reason why a plant does or does not live in a particular region is about climate. It takes a lot of study, actually, though, to sort out another one of these problems about Koeppen's system, and that is that there's no obvious way to sort out whether it is the precipitation or the temperature that limits where a plant lives. We don't have saguaro cactuses in Omaha. Do saguaros not live here because it's too cold or because it's too wet? I don't know. It would take a plant biologist to sort that out, and I'm not that person. Somebody else has, but I don't know the answer to that. It's also true that it's not readily quantified when you use this system. If you know you have a type C climate, well, what exactly does that mean the temperature is in that region? Well, that doesn't quite tell us that. But it does give us a broad sense of the type of weather and the type of climate that the region is going to, in general, experience. All right, so starting off with what Koeppen would call the type A climates. The type A climates are going to be your tropical moist climates, and they're the areas labeled on this map with the different colors. Again, he had lots of subtypes. Don't worry about that. We're just going to worry about the general broad type A climates. And you can see that these type A climates in general are going to be spanning the tropics. They're going to be the locations under the ITCZ, where they're going to be getting lots of precipitation all year round. One key idea that we're going to be using in this unit of this lecture today is we're going to be talking about these different climate regions in terms of biomes. This is a term that you knew back in like 4th grade science, kind of the communities of animals and plants that live in these regions. And if we were talking about a typical biome of a tropical moist climate, a type A climate, we'd be talking about things like rainforests and jungles. And, you know, that kind of stirs your memory in nature specials and National Geographic and stuff like that. You know what a jungle and a rainforest looks like, and they are all tropical moist climates. All of the plants and animals that live there none of them are short on water. All of the plants that live there are getting plenty of rainfall. There are no plants that cannot live in a type A climate because of a shortage of rainfall. Now, in jungles and rainforests, that's typically rainfall that falls all year round. But savannas and monsoon regions also count as type A climates, and typically they have a wet season and a dry season. They just get so much rainfall in their wet season that they're able to plants can grow year round in that location. Savannas, in case you're unfamiliar with that word for that particular biome, savannas are often sometimes described as a tall grass prairie. If I were trying to give you a hint as to how to know if a region is a type A climate, I would say probably your best bet is to think about elephants. If an elephant can live there, it's probably a type A climate. I know we don't normally use animals to judge climate types on the Koeppen system, but if you're thinking about places an elephant can live, you're probably thinking about your type A climates. Turning now to Koeppen's type B climate. Type B climates are the dry climates. These are going to be under the subtropical high pressure belts around the world. No single climate type covers more land area than the type B climates do. Again, there's a couple of different subtypes of type Bs, but that's not what we're going to worry about. We're just broadly talking about the type B climates. And when you're picturing a type B climate, you're mainly thinking about deserts, or what in climatology they would refer to as a true desert. This is when you have, very little vegetation, mostly just loose sand being moved by the wind, etc. And they can get some rain during the year, but the temperatures are so high that whatever rain falls, it almost immediately evaporates. And so you get these very dry climates. Whatever plants do manage to live there have to be extremely well adapted to conserving water, to being dormant when there isn't water, etc. I know you're picturing deserts when we talk about type B climates, but you also want to talk about steppes. Again, steppe might not be a biome that you're familiar with. Steppes are short grass prairies. They don't actually get all that much rain, but they have enough rain and the right kind of soils that instead of just having cacti or something like that, they actually have short grasses. Think eastern Colorado, think lots of Kansas, think western Nebraska. These parts of the world are also examples of, I know, how about South Dakota? Most of South Dakota would be a type B climate as well. So they don't really get very much precipitation, but they do have, so they count as a type B climate, but they do actually have some plant cover rather than a true desert. Koeppen's type C doesn't have a name that describes that really rolls off your tongue. We often hear them described as moist subtropical mid-latitude climates, and that's an awkward term. What we're talking about here, if you look at the map here and you look at the kind of regions we're talking about, these are going to be places that they're going to still have a distinct winter, but it's not going to be a very serious winter. We're talking places like Florida, Georgia, California, most of Europe, most of Australia, etc. They don't really get very serious winters, but there is a difference between their warm season and their cold season. Their summers, on the other hand, have something in common. They are very, very muggy. So they have mild winters and muggy summers. And when I'm thinking about a type C climate, I'm picturing Florida or Georgia or Louisiana, places that have very muggy, moist climates with very mild winters. Also, like Western Europe would be a good example here. I do want to steer you towards one particular vocabulary term here. Mediterranean climates are an example of type C climates. Mediterranean climates are very common in places like, southern France and Italy, parts of northern Africa, but also like, say, southern California. Mediterranean climates have a dry summer and a wet winter. That's actually the opposite of a monsoon. Remember, monsoons had wet summers and dry winters. And so you have places like southern California where it never really rains in the summer, and then in the winter they have a rainy season. Technically, those match also as a type C climate. Koeppen's type D are going to be the locations that have relatively moist climates and harsh winters. And if you look at the map of where we are, we're mainly talking like the northern high latitudes. We're talking, the northern half of the United States. We're talking most of Canada, most of Alaska, all of Siberia, all of Scandinavia, etc. And I know you wouldn't normally think of moist here. I mean, some of these places don't necessarily get all that many inches of rain per year, but keep in mind their temperatures overall are colder. So even though, they might only get a few inches of rain per year in some place like Alaska or, Alberta or something like that, the rain doesn't evaporate very quickly, and as a consequence, it can be used to make trees, whereas the same amount of rain, say, in the Sahara Desert, would support almost no plant life at all. I want to introduce you to an important vocabulary word. Again, you probably knew this term in like fourth grade science, but everybody forgets it. That's taiga, T-A-I-G-A. Taiga is a term that means like northern forests. And northern forests are a great example of the type D climates. These are places with like big stands of pine forests, etc. And they have very harsh winters, and they tend to have plenty of moisture to support all these trees. This also includes, of course, places that were taiga before mankind came along and cut down all the trees. So most of like the American Midwest, like Iowa and Missouri. I'm sorry, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, etc. Most of these places count as type D climates too, even though there really aren't very many trees there in comparison to a couple hundred years ago or whatever. The fifth climate type that Koeppen introduced was type E, the polar climates. And again, on this map here, they exist in pretty much the places you're expecting. Northern Alaska, Greenland, northern Canada, the extreme northern fringe of Siberia, etc. Within the type E climates, there's a few subtypes like ice caps. Ice caps are they are what you're picturing when you're picturing a polar climate, and they basically have no vegetation whatsoever. Maybe some kinds of bacteria or lichens or something like that, but by and large, there's almost no plant life on the ice cap. But another type of type E climate would be tundra. Tundra is a type E climate. Tundra is characterized by like flowering bushes, short grasses, dwarf trees, etc. You don't get big forests, you don't get big grasslands, etc. But this is a place where a lot of animals might migrate to in the summer to eat the plants and so on, or to nest in the standing ponds and so on. And, excuse me. Another important term actually inside of the type E climates would be this term permafrost. Permafrost isn't a climate type or something like that, but that's a vocabulary word you should know. Permafrost is soil that is permanently frozen. Possibly the top few inches will thaw in the summer season, but by and large, down to a depth of hundreds and hundreds of feet, the soil is frozen. You can kind of see the edge of some permafrost here. And so none of the plants that live in the tundra on top of the permafrost can have very deep roots. They can't sink their roots through this frozen soil, and so they just have shallow roots right there at the top of the layer of permafrost. There's just one more category in the Koeppen system, and that is the type H or Highland climates. Koeppen recognized that in the mountains, very different climates can be very close to each other just due to the rapid changes in elevation. And that can result in biomes or communities of animals and plants that kind of overlap. And so kind of type H sort of catches all of those different highland climate types. In particular, a lot of times in the mountains they have kind of a thicket-oriented climate system where the vegetation tends to just sort of be scrubby trees and thickets. That's a good example of a climate type known as chaparral. And there's all these different highland climate types that just sort of all get lumped together in type H. All right, so we've made it through all the different climate types in the Koeppen system. One of the things I want you to notice is there really is a lot of vocabulary in this material. The good news is this tends to be the kind of thing that folks are pretty good at studying, and so they tend to notice these words and know the definitions and so on, and they get the questions right. Again, I have to emphasize you do need to know the climate types by letter. So, for example, a perfectly fair climate type question on to the test would be, which of the four following climate types in the Koeppen system covers the most land area? Type A, Type B, Type C, Type D. Well, if you were listening closely today, you know that the answer is Type B. The deserts and steppes cover more land area than any of the other types of climate. And so, I mean, without knowing what Type A and Type B, Type C were, you couldn't even have guessed on that question. So you do have to actually know them by letter. One last thing I want to kind of wrap up, actually, when I'm talking about this Koeppen system is a perfectly good question of what climate type is Omaha? Well, if I were trying to just guess Omaha itself, I'd have to go with Type D. Historically, before humans came along and cut all the trees down, this was a largely forested area. You can still see some forests in places like Fontenelle or Neil Woods, although those are both examples of places that have been clear-cut, and these are new forests that have grown in. But it kind of gives a sense. I mean, we have the severe winters and so on. But if we are type D, we don't extend. Type D certainly doesn't extend very far west from Omaha. You don't have to go particularly far west in Omaha before we really start becoming a prairie, and a shortgrass prairie at that. So most of Nebraska certainly would count as a type B climate. So Omaha certainly is on the boundary between type B and type D climates. Although I think we would all agree Omaha is probably more forested than prairie. But like I said, you don't have to go far west before you're definitely in type B. All right, so make sure you get the PowerPoint that's associated with this lecture, and if you have any questions, please let me know. This has been Dr. John Schrage.